The other day I clicked on this article online because it had a fascinating title to me. The title of this article was The Supernatural Power of Forgiveness. The Supernatural Power of Forgiveness. So that sounds interesting and apropos for our readings today. And it was a story that a woman had wrote about her father-in-law, her husband's dad, who had died just a few days before. She was saying it was hard to really grieve for him because she didn't know him at all, because decades before, her husband's dad basically rejected him and many of his other kids and really was just no longer a part of their life at all. Of course, you got to imagine that would have caused a lot of hurt and consternation among that family. Just a couple of years ago, it came to be known that this dad was sick with a lot of different diseases, and that he was going to die sooner rather than later. And his son, this woman's husband, who had been basically rejected, abandoned by his father, just continued to have this conviction that he wanted his father to reconcile with God and to try to reconcile with those he had hurt. And he had this great care for his father's soul, the state of his eternal soul. Even though his father had obviously not treated him very well and stepped up to the plate as he needed to as a dad, he just had this burning desire for this forgiveness. That's what led this woman to write this article and talk about the supernatural power of forgiveness, because, let's face it, we just can't get there on our own. We need the grace of God to do what we can't do. And so, one day her husband went into his hospital room to visit his dad, which was, again, kind of difficult because he really didn't see him much for decades. But he wanted to step into that breach of mercy. And he told his dad that he forgave him, and he wanted him to try to make amends with other people he had hurt. This dad, for some reason, didn't understand the hurt he had caused. But for this lady's husband, that didn't matter. What mattered was his forgiveness and his desire to have his father, who had done so much damage, to come to some healing and some wholeness, and honestly to live with God forever in heaven. And it was a witness to this woman who wrote this article about that supernatural power of forgiveness, that's only by the grace of God that is able to happen. Supernatural, above the natural. Because our natural inclination, right, is maybe to just hold on to resentments and hurt and maybe a desire for payback or whatever it might be. I think an interesting lens for our readings on forgiveness today is actually the second reading. When St. Paul talks about how none of us lives for oneself, none of us dies for oneself. Whether we live for the Lord. Whether we die for the Lord. Whether we live or die, we're for the Lord. That the whole of our life has been surrounded by God. This happens through our baptism, when we first actually spiritually die and rise with Christ to a new life and become a new creation and look to indeed take on his life and to live his life. And that no matter what happens in our life, we belong to the Lord, not only here on earth, but forever in heaven. And so that should have some kind of a window then into how we view our life here on earth, especially the challenges and the hurts and the struggles and all those kind of things. That we belong to the Lord, who has loved us into existence, who has shown us that he is rich in kindness and mercy and slow to anger and full of compassion, who has paid the debt for us on the cross. It is this Jesus whose life we enter into as part of the church. Even in our first reading, we heard in Sirach, he said, remember your death, remember the covenant that you have with God. And so do we want our life here on earth to be hung up on anger and hurt and resentment and bitterness, or something else? Now, forgiveness, of course, it doesn't ignore injuries, it doesn't ignore injustices, it doesn't ignore hurt. Forgiveness doesn't automatically mean a reconciliation with someone this side of heaven. It just means that what we're actually owed from someone else in love and justice that maybe hasn't happened, we let go of. By the grace of God, we choose to let go of the debt that others owe us. And in that, as we hear in our scriptures today, we find healing, we can find freedom, we can find peace. We know here in the Mass, we have a Holy Communion with Jesus. This Jesus who on the cross said to those who put him up there, "Father, forgive them, they know not what they do." This cross of Jesus that shows us the depths of his love for us. This cross of mercy, this cross of forgiveness, which again, Jesus offers us to have a share in his life as we go forward in this life and keep our eye on the life that lasts forever. So as we encounter Christ here in the Mass today, let's have that be a new encounter with his great love and mercy, and knowing that he brings us to himself, that we have that grace, that supernatural power to indeed go out and live his life.